My name is Thaddeus Krawczyk, and I am an underground mapper who survived the first 6 weeks of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted on October 15th, I was crawling through storm drains beneath Denver. Within days, the surface world froze solid while violent survivors hunted me through the tunnels. I had to choose between my antisocial survival instincts and protecting innocent families from both the deadly cold above and the killers below. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Thaddeus Krawczyk, and I am recording this message from 50 feet beneath what used to be the streets of downtown Denver. If you are watching this, it means someone found one of the copies I left scattered throughout the tunnel system. It means there might still be hope for survivors on the surface. I need to tell you everything that happened during those first 6 weeks after Yellowstone erupted, because the knowledge I am about to share could save your life. I was never what you would call a normal person. While most people worked in offices or shops, I spent my days crawling through storm drains, mapping utility tunnels, and documenting the hidden infrastructure that keeps cities running. My official job title was Urban Infrastructure Mapper for the Denver Department of Public Works, but that barely scratched the surface of what I actually did. I knew every abandoned subway tunnel, every forgotten maintenance corridor, every steam, pipe and sewer line that snaked beneath the city like arteries in a massive underground body. People always thought I was strange for preferring the dark, cramped spaces below ground to the open air above. My coworkers called me Tadpole because of how easily I could slip through tight spaces that would trap anyone else. I lived alone in a basement apartment on 17th Street, kept to myself, and spent my free time exploring sections of the underground that were not even on the city maps. Most people found my obsession with tunnels unsettling, but I always told them the same thing. The real city exists below ground. Everything up there is just decoration built on top of what really matters. What they did not know was that I had been preparing for disaster my entire adult life. Not because I was paranoid, but because I understood something that most people chose to ignore. I had studied every major volcanic event in recorded history, from Mount Tambora in 1816 to the Toba supervolcano eruption that nearly wiped out humanity 74,000 years ago. I knew that volcanic winters could last for years, dropping global temperatures by 10 degrees or more and causing mass starvation and societal collapse. I knew that Yellowstone was not just a tourist attraction with pretty geysers, but a supervolcano that was overdue for an eruption that would make every other natural disaster in American history look like a minor inconvenience. My apartment was filled with books about historical climate disasters, geological surveys, and government reports about volcanic hazards that most people never bothered to read. I had charts showing how the Little Ice Age was triggered by volcanic activity, how the Laki eruption in Iceland caused famine across Europe, and how even smaller eruptions had toppled entire civilizations. Every night, I would study these patterns and ask myself the same question. When Yellowstone finally erupted, where would be the safest place to survive the aftermath? The answer was always the same: underground. So over the years, I had quietly created a network of emergency supply caches throughout Denver's underground system. Nothing obvious or suspicious, just sealed containers hidden in forgotten maintenance rooms and abandoned utility shafts. Canned food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, tools, warm clothing, and detailed maps of every tunnel system in the city. I told myself it was just a hobby, like other people collect stamps or build model trains. But deep down, I knew I was preparing for the day when the surface world would become uninhabitable, and the only way to survive would be to go underground. Each cache was carefully planned and positioned. I had one near the old Paramount Theater in a maintenance room that connected to the steam tunnels. Another was hidden in the abandoned subway section beneath Union Station, sealed inside a fake electrical panel that I had installed myself. A third cache was located in the old mining tunnels that predated the city itself, accessible through a hidden entrance in the basement of a condemned building. I had 17 caches total, spread across the entire underground network, each one containing enough supplies to keep one person alive for 2 weeks. I also spent years timing different routes through the tunnel system, calculating how long it would take to move between caches under various conditions. I knew which passages flooded during heavy rain, which sections had the best air circulation, and which routes would remain passable even if parts of the surface infrastructure collapsed. I had backup routes for my backup, routes and emergency exits that most city engineers did not even know existed. My coworkers thought I was obsessive about documentation, but they did not understand that every map I drew and every measurement I recorded could mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. When other people were watching television or going to bars after work, I was crawling through storm drains with a measuring tape and a notebook, building the knowledge that would eventually save my life. That day came on October 15th, 2025, at exactly 2:37 in the afternoon. I was timing my route through the old mining tunnels that connected to the abandoned subway system beneath Union Station. A client from the university wanted to photograph the underground architecture for some art project about forgotten urban spaces, and I needed to calculate safe travel times through the various passages. I had my stopwatch running and was making notes on my waterproof pad when the first report started crackling through my radio. The surface crews were talking about unusual seismic readings from the Yellowstone region, but that was not what caught my attention. It was the tone in their voices. These were experienced city workers who dealt with emergencies every day: water main breaks, gas leaks, electrical failures. But they sounded genuinely frightened. Then the dispatcher came on and told all units to evacuate the Yellowstone region immediately. That was when I knew something catastrophic was happening. I climbed up through a maintenance access near Union Station and emerged into what looked like the end of the world. The entire western horizon had turned black, not like storm clouds, but like someone had drawn a line across the sky with a marker. The darkness was rolling toward us with unnatural uniformity, and the air already smelled like sulfur and burning metal. People on the street were pointing and taking pictures with their phones, but I could see the fear in their faces. This was not weather. This was something much worse. I immediately called my supervisor to report what I was seeing, but the phone lines were already jammed. Emergency services were overwhelmed with calls from across the region. I tried to access news websites on my phone, but the internet was struggling under the load of millions of people trying to get information simultaneously. The few sites that loaded were showing the same thing. Yellowstone had erupted. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the first ash began falling like gray snow. By 6 o'clock that evening, visibility was reduced to less than a block in any direction. The news stations that were still broadcasting confirmed what I already knew. Yellowstone had erupted, not just the geysers and hot springs, but the entire supervolcano that had been building pressure for hundreds of thousands of years. The initial explosion had been heard as far away as Chicago, and the ash cloud was already covering Wyoming, Colorado, and spreading east at incredible speed. The reporters were calling it the largest volcanic event in recorded history, but I knew they were understating the situation. This was an extinction-level event. That first night, I sat in my apartment watching the news coverage and making calculations based on historical data. The Tambora eruption had ejected 12 cubic miles of ash and rock into the atmosphere. Early estimates suggested that Yellowstone had ejected over 200 cubic miles of material. The ash cloud would circle the globe within weeks, blocking sunlight and dropping temperatures worldwide. But the immediate threat was local. Denver was directly in the path of the heaviest ashfall, and we would bear the brunt of the initial temperature drop. Within 3 days, the temperature in Denver had dropped 20 degrees. The ash mixed with normal precipitation to create a gray slush that coated everything and turned the city into something from a nightmare. You could look directly at the sun through the ash cloud, just a dim orange disk that provided almost no warmth. The air itself became difficult to breathe without covering your nose and mouth with cloth or masks. I watched from my basement apartment window as my neighbors loaded their cars and joined the massive exodus heading south on Interstate 25. Thousands of vehicles stretched to the horizon, all trying to reach warmer climates before the real cold set in. The smart ones had left within hours of the eruption, but most people waited too long. They thought the government would fix everything, that this was just a temporary emergency like a hurricane or flood. They did not understand that there was nowhere to run from a volcanic winter. The highways became parking lots as vehicles broke down in the ash and cold. I could hear the constant wail of sirens as emergency crews tried to respond to accidents and breakdowns, but they were fighting a losing battle. The ash was clogging air filters, the cold was draining batteries, and the roads themselves were becoming impassable as the ash mixed with snow and ice to create a surface that was impossible to navigate safely. My upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, knocked on my door on day 5 carrying 2 suitcases and her cat carrier. She was a retired teacher in her 70s, and she looked terrified. She asked if I was planning to evacuate, and when I told her I was staying, she thought I had lost my mind. She said the television was reporting that temperatures could drop another 30 degrees over the next 2 weeks. I tried to explain that the highways were already becoming death traps, that most of those fleeing south would never make it to safety. But she would not listen. She said she would rather die trying to escape than freeze in Denver like a trapped rat. I offered to let her stay in my apartment, where I had extra blankets and emergency supplies, but she was convinced that salvation lay somewhere else. She had relatives in Arizona who had promised to take her in if she could just get there. I helped her carry her bags to her car and watched her drive away into the gray wasteland that Interstate 25 had become. That was the last time I saw Mrs. Patterson alive. By day 7, it was snowing heavily. Real snow mixed with volcanic ash that created the most unnatural precipitation I had ever seen. The flakes were gray and gritty, and they left a film on everything they touched that was impossible to wash off. The power grid was struggling as coal plants could not get clean air to their intake systems, and solar panels were completely useless under the ash cloud. Rolling blackouts started on day 9 and became permanent failures by day 12. That was when most people finally understood that this was not going to be a short-term emergency. The grocery stores had been cleaned out by day 5, but that did not matter because supply trucks had stopped running when the highways became impassable. Gas stations ran dry because fuel deliveries could not get through the ash and snow. The baked city's emergency services were overwhelmed and then simply disappeared as personnel either fled or died, trying to maintain infrastructure that was designed for normal weather conditions. My apartment building had 24 units, and by day 14, only 6 were still occupied. The Wilson family on the 3rd floor had tried to drive to California, but turned back when their car broke down 50 miles south of the city. Mr. Kowalski from the 2nd floor was a Korean War veteran who said he had survived worse conditions, but I could hear him coughing through the walls as the ash irritated his lungs. The young couple in apartment 8, Jake and Sarah, had plenty of food, but no heat after their furnace failed and no repair technicians were available. Jake worked in IT and thought he could fix anything with the right YouTube tutorial, but heating systems require parts and expertise that were no longer available. Sarah was a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, but the hospital had closed on day 10, when staff could no longer safely travel to work, and critical supply deliveries stopped arriving. They were both intelligent people, but they had no experience with true survival situations. I tried to convince them to come with me into the underground tunnels where the temperature was still above freezing, but they looked at me like I was suggesting they move to another planet. The Wilson family said they would rather take their chances in their apartment than live like moles in sewer tunnels. Mr. Kowalski said he was too old to be crawling around in the dark. Jake and Sarah just laughed and said they would wait for the government rescue teams that were supposedly coming from FEMA. None of them understood what I had learned from studying historical volcanic events. The Tambora eruption in 1816 caused global famine and was known as the year without a summer. Entire regions of Europe and North America experienced crop failures and mass starvation. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo was partially attributed to the unseasonably cold and wet weather caused by volcanic ash in the atmosphere. But that was just a regular volcano. Yellowstone was a supervolcano with 1,000 times more power, and its effects would last for years, not months. On day 16, I found Mr. Kowalski dead in his apartment. He had run out of his heart medication and the cold had put too much strain on his system. His apartment was so cold that his body had not even begun to decompose. I wrapped him in blankets and said a prayer, but there was no way to give him a proper burial. The ground was frozen solid and there were no functioning funeral services. On day 18, when the snow was 4 feet deep and still falling, I made my final attempt to save my neighbors. I went door to door with detailed maps of the tunnel system and explained how we could survive underground using the geothermal heat from the city's infrastructure. I showed them my supply caches and demonstrated how the tunnels connected to every major building downtown. I even offered to share all my resources if they would just trust me and come below ground. The Wilson family was polite but firm in their refusal. They had 3 young children and could not imagine taking them into dark tunnels filled with who knows what dangers. They were waiting for the weather to improve so they could try driving south again. Jake and Sarah were more interested, but Sarah was pregnant and worried about the safety of crawling through confined spaces. They asked if I could bring supplies to them instead of them coming with me. But I explained that my caches were positioned strategically throughout the tunnel system and could not be moved without losing their effectiveness. That night, I lay in my freezing apartment listening to the wind howl through the building's broken windows and made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I was going underground, and I was going alone. I packed my essential gear, sealed my apartment with plastic sheeting to preserve anything I might need later, and descended into the tunnel system that I knew better than anyone else in the city. My first destination was the cache near the Paramount Theater. I had to navigate 3 different tunnel systems to reach it, but the route was burned into my memory from years of practice runs. The temperature underground was a constant 45 degrees Fahrenheit, almost tropical compared to the surface conditions. My cache was exactly where I had left it, sealed and undisturbed. What I did not know was that I was not the only person who had decided that the underground was the key to survival. As I made my way through the maintenance corridors beneath the old Paramount Theater, I heard voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the system. At first, I thought it might be other city workers or maybe utility repair crews still trying to maintain essential services. But something about the voices did not sound right. They were too quiet, too careful, like people who were trying not to be discovered. I clicked off my headlamp and listened more carefully. The voices were coming from the direction of the old subway tunnels, the sections that had been abandoned when the light rail project was canceled in the 90s. Those tunnels were supposed to be sealed, but I knew at least 6 different ways to access them. If other people had found ways inside, it meant they were either very resourceful or very desperate. In my experience, desperate people in survival situations could be more dangerous than any environmental threat. The voices were male, at least 3 different speakers, and they were discussing something about supplies and territory. I caught fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. They were talking about taking what they needed from anyone they found, about how the normal rules did not apply anymore. These were not fellow survivors looking for cooperation. These were predators who saw the collapse of civilization as an opportunity. I made a mental note of their approximate location and continued toward my first supply cache near the old mining tunnels. I had work to do and preparations to make before I could worry about whoever else was sharing my underground domain. But as I moved through the familiar darkness, I could not shake the feeling that my carefully planned solitary survival strategy was about to become much more complicated. The voices in the tunnels were just the beginning of challenges I had never anticipated in all my years of preparation. The voices in the abandoned subway tunnels haunted me as I made my way to my first supply cache, but I had more immediate concerns. The surface world was dying above me, and I needed to establish a sustainable routine in the underground system that had become my new home. The cache near the old mining tunnels was intact, exactly as I had left it 3 years earlier. When I first started preparing for this scenario, inside the waterproof container I found 2 weeks' worth of canned food, water purification tablets, a portable camping stove with fuel canisters, warm clothing, and most importantly, detailed maps of every tunnel system in Denver that I had hand-drawn over the years. These maps were my most valuable possession because they showed connections and passages that did not exist in any official city records. When Denver's light rail system was planned in the 1990s, they had excavated extensive tunnel networks before the project was canceled due to budget overruns. Most people assumed these tunnels were sealed and forgotten, but I had spent years finding ways to access them. They connected to the older mining tunnels from the 1800s, the utility corridors from the 1950s, and the modern storm drain system. Together, they formed a vast network that stretched for miles beneath the city. The key to surviving underground was understanding that different sections served different purposes. The mining tunnels were the deepest and most stable, but they could flood during heavy precipitation. The utility corridors had the best access to water and electrical systems, but they were regularly patrolled by city workers under normal circumstances. The storm drains provided the most direct routes between different areas, but they were also the most likely to be discovered by other survivors. My maps showed all of these systems and how they interconnected, knowledge that no one else possessed. During my first week underground, I established a routine that would keep me alive and undetected. I would spend the daylight hours in the deepest sections where sound did not carry to the surface, and I would move between different areas during the night when any noise I made would be masked by the constant wind and settling of the frozen city above. I learned to navigate entirely by feel and memory, using my headlamp only when absolutely necessary. The red filter I had installed years earlier preserved my night vision, while providing just enough light to read my maps and check my equipment. The temperature underground remained a constant 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which felt warm compared to the minus 20 degrees on the surface. But 45 degrees was still cold enough to be dangerous without proper clothing and shelter. I had prepared for this by caching sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures and multiple layers of insulation. More importantly, I knew which sections of the tunnel system were heated by geothermal sources or residual warmth from buried utility lines. The old mining tunnels had natural hot springs that the 19th century miners had tapped for their operations. These springs still flowed, providing a source of warm water that I could use for drinking, cooking, and washing. The utility corridors contained steam pipes that carried heat to downtown buildings, and even though most of those buildings were now abandoned, the pipes retained warmth for hours after the heating systems failed. By positioning my sleeping areas near these heat sources, I could maintain body temperature without burning through my limited fuel supplies. But the most important discovery I made during that first week was that I was not alone in recognizing the survival potential of Denver's underground system. The voices I had heard near the Paramount Theater were not an isolated incident. As I moved through different sections of the tunnel network, I found evidence of other people everywhere. Makeshift camps and utility rooms, empty food containers, and most disturbing, graffiti that marked territory and warned others to stay away. The graffiti was not random vandalism, but organized communication between different groups of survivors. Some markings indicated safe areas where people could find temporary shelter. Others warned of dangerous sections where violence had occurred. The most common symbol I found was a crude drawing of a razor blade with the letters R and Z underneath. This symbol appeared in dozens of locations throughout the tunnel system, always accompanied by threatening messages about what would happen to anyone caught in those areas without permission. On day 22, I encountered my first fellow survivor face to face. I was checking one of my supply caches in the abandoned subway section when I heard footsteps approaching from the main tunnel. I immediately clicked off my headlamp and pressed myself against the wall, hoping whoever was coming would pass by without noticing the entrance to the maintenance room where I was hiding. But the footsteps stopped directly outside, and I heard an elderly woman's voice calling softly into the darkness. She said she knew someone was in there because she had seen the light from my headlamp, and she promised she was not going to hurt me. She said her name was Chen, and that she had been following me for 2 days because she needed help. Against my better judgment, I turned my headlamp back on and found myself looking at a woman in her 70s, dressed in multiple layers of winter clothing and carrying a small backpack. She was Asian American, probably Chinese based on her accent, and she looked exhausted but determined. Mrs. Chen explained that she had lived in my apartment building for 15 years, in Unit 12 on the second floor. I vaguely remembered seeing her in the lobby occasionally, but we had never spoken beyond polite greetings. She said she had watched me disappear into the basement on day 18 and had figured out that I was accessing some kind of tunnel system. When her apartment became too cold to survive in, she had followed my route and spent 3 days trying to find me in the underground maze. What made Mrs. Chen different from my other neighbors was that she actually understood the severity of our situation. She had lived through the Chinese famine of 1959 to 1961, when volcanic eruptions and climate disasters had killed millions of people. She knew that government rescue was not coming, that the surface world would remain uninhabitable for years, and that our only chance of survival was to adapt to living underground permanently. Mrs. Chen also brought skills that I lacked. She had been a military nurse during the Vietnam War before immigrating to America, which meant she had medical training and experience with survival situations. More importantly, she had psychological resilience that came from surviving previous disasters. While my other neighbors had been paralyzed by the enormity of what was happening, Mrs. Chen had immediately started planning for long-term survival. She had been rationing her food carefully and had managed to gather additional supplies from abandoned apartments in our building. She showed me medications she had collected from neighbors who had fled or died, including antibiotics and pain relievers that would be invaluable if either of us got injured or sick. She had also taken warm clothing, batteries, candles, and anything else that might be useful for extended survival. But what impressed me most about Mrs. Chen was that she had not come to me as a helpless victim looking for rescue. She came as someone who wanted to form a partnership based on mutual benefit. She offered to share her medical knowledge and supplies in exchange for access to my tunnel maps and underground expertise. She understood that neither of us was likely to survive alone, but together we might have a chance. I agreed to let Mrs. Chen join me, but I made it clear that I was in charge of navigation and security decisions. The underground system was dangerous, in ways that most people could not imagine, and one mistake could get both of us killed. She accepted these terms without argument and proved to be an excellent partner from the very beginning. Mrs. Chen was small enough to fit through tight passages that might have been difficult for larger people, but she was also surprisingly strong for her age. Her military training had taught her to move quietly and follow instructions precisely, skills that were essential for navigating the tunnels safely. Most importantly, she understood the need for absolute silence when we were moving through areas where other survivors might be present. Together, we established a more secure base of operations in one of the deeper mining tunnels that had access to the natural hot springs. Mrs. Chen used her medical knowledge to create a sanitary area where we could treat injuries or illness without risk of infection. I used my engineering background to improve our shelter by redirecting warm air from the steam pipes and creating better drainage to prevent flooding during snowmelts. But our partnership also revealed how much more dangerous the underground had become since my initial descent. Mrs. Chen had witnessed things during her 3 days alone in the tunnels that confirmed my worst fears about the other survivors. She had seen groups of men moving through the utility corridors with weapons, clearly hunting for other people rather than just scavenging for supplies. She had heard screaming from the direction of the old subway terminals that suggested violence was occurring regularly. Most disturbing, she had encountered evidence of the group that was marking territory with razor blade symbols. In one of the maintenance rooms near the downtown steam tunnels, she found the body of a man who had been beaten to death with blunt objects. Carved into the wall above the body was the message that anyone found in razor territory without permission would face the same fate. This was not random violence by desperate survivors, but organized predation by people who saw the collapse of civilization as an opportunity to take whatever they wanted through force. Mrs. Chen's medical examination of the body revealed that the victim had been tortured before being killed, suggesting that the Razor Group was not just eliminating competition for resources, but actively enjoying the violence they inflicted. She found evidence that the victim had been carrying food and water when he was attacked, but those supplies were gone, taken by his killers along with his warm clothing and any other useful equipment. This discovery forced me to completely reevaluate my survival strategy. I had planned to remain hidden and avoid contact with other survivors until the immediate crisis passed, but it was becoming clear that isolation was not going to be an option. The Razor Group was actively hunting for other people throughout the tunnel system, and it was only a matter of time before they found us. We needed to either find a way to defend ourselves or locate other survivors who were willing to work together against the common threat. Mrs. Chen suggested that we try to make contact with some of the less threatening survivors she had observed during her time alone in the tunnels. She had seen families with children who were clearly not part of the Razor Group, people who were hiding rather than hunting. She thought we might be able to form a larger group that could provide mutual protection and share resources more effectively. I was reluctant to reveal our location to strangers, but Mrs. Chen made a compelling argument. She pointed out that the Razor Group was growing stronger and more organized every day, while isolated survivors were being picked off one by one. Our best chance of long-term survival was to build our own organization that could match their numbers and coordination. We had advantages they lacked, including my knowledge of the tunnel system and her medical skills, but we needed more people to make those advantages meaningful. On day 26, we made our first attempt to contact other survivors. I had identified a family with 2 young children who were hiding in the utility corridors near the old Denver Center for the Performing Arts. They had been careful to avoid the Razor Group territories, but they were clearly struggling to find enough food and warmth to keep the children healthy. Mrs. Chen thought they would be receptive to joining a larger group if we approached them carefully. We spent hours planning our approach, deciding exactly what we would say and how we would demonstrate that we were not a threat. Mrs. Chen would take the lead in the conversation because her age and medical background made her seem less threatening than I would. I would remain hidden nearby with an escape route planned in case the encounter went badly. But when we reached the area where the family had been sheltering, we found their camp abandoned and signs of a struggle. Food containers were scattered across the floor, children's clothing was torn and left behind, and there were bloodstains on the walls that Mrs. Chen confirmed were fresh. The Razor Group had found them first. We searched the surrounding tunnels for any sign of what had happened to the family, but we found only more evidence of violence. In a maintenance room 50 yards away, we discovered graffiti that had not been there the day before. It was a message from the Razor Group announcing that they now controlled the entire utility corridor section and that anyone found there would be killed on sight. They were expanding their territory systematically, eliminating competition and taking whatever resources they found. This discovery changed everything. The Razor Group was not just a gang of opportunistic criminals, but an organized force that was actively conquering the underground system section by section. They had military-style discipline and planning that suggested at least some of their members had combat experience. They were not going to be satisfied with controlling small territories. They were going to keep expanding until they dominated the entire tunnel network. Mrs. Chen and I retreated to our secure base in the mining tunnels and spent the next 2 days planning our response. We had 3 options. We could try to hide deeper underground and hope the Razor Group never found us. We could attempt to escape to the surface and take our chances with the frozen wasteland above. Or we could find other survivors and organize resistance against the Razor Group before they became too powerful to stop. The first option was appealing, but ultimately hopeless. The Razor Group was conducting systematic searches of the tunnel system, and they would eventually find every hiding place no matter how remote. The second option was suicide. The surface temperature had dropped to -30 degrees and was still falling. That left the third option, which was dangerous, but offered the only real chance of long-term survival. We needed allies, and we needed them soon. Mrs. Chen had identified several other individuals in small groups during her initial days in the tunnels, people who were hiding rather than hunting. If we could find them and convince them to work together, we might be able to create an organization capable of standing up to the Razor Group. But we would have to move quickly before more of them were killed or captured. As I prepared for what would essentially be a recruitment mission through the most dangerous parts of the tunnel system, I realized that my solitary survival plan had been naive from the beginning. The underground was not a refuge from human conflict, but simply a new arena where that conflict would play out. The same territorial instincts and violent impulses that had shaped human history were now being expressed in the tunnels beneath Denver, and neutrality was not going to be an option for much longer. The war for the underground was about to begin, and Mrs. Chen and I were going to be right in the middle of it. The voices coming from the deep caves belonged to a family that had discovered the geothermal chambers 3 days before I arrived. The Hendersons were different from any survivors I had encountered so far. Tom Henderson was a former Army medic who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before becoming a paramedic with Denver Fire Department. His wife Linda was a high school science teacher, and their 2 children, Emma and Jake, were 8 and 10 years old respectively. What made the Hendersons remarkable was not just their survival skills, but their organizational approach to the crisis. Tom had military training that complemented Mrs. Chen's medical experience, and Linda had scientific knowledge that helped her understand the environmental challenges we were facing. The children had adapted to underground life with the resilience that only young minds possess, treating the cave system like an underground adventure rather than a nightmare scenario. Tom had reached the same conclusions about Razor's group that we had, but from a different perspective. As a first responder, he had dealt with gang violence and organized crime throughout his career. He recognized the pattern of territorial expansion and resource control that Razor was implementing. More importantly, he had observed their recruitment methods and understood that they were specifically targeting people with useful skills, while eliminating those they considered weak or useless. Linda brought a scientific perspective that changed how I understood our long-term survival prospects. She had been teaching earth science when the eruption occurred, and she understood the atmospheric effects of volcanic ash better than anyone else in our group. According to her calculations based on historical data from previous supervolcanic events, the ash cloud would remain thick enough to block significant sunlight for at least 2 years, possibly longer. This meant that surface agriculture would be impossible for the foreseeable future. Any crops that survived the initial ashfall would be killed by the extended winter conditions. Livestock would die from cold and lack of feed. The global food supply chain that supported modern civilization would collapse completely, leading to mass starvation on a scale that humanity had never experienced. The implications were staggering. Even if we survived the initial crisis, we would emerge into a world where the fundamental systems that supported human civilization no longer existed. There would be no government services, no infrastructure maintenance, no food production, and no medical care beyond what individual communities could provide for themselves. We were not just surviving a temporary disaster, we were witnessing the end of the modern world. This realization fundamentally changed our survival strategy. We were no longer planning for a few months of hardship, followed by rescue and recovery. We were planning for a permanent transformation of human society, and our underground community might be one of the few groups with the knowledge and resources necessary to preserve some fragment of civilization through the coming Dark Age. Tom's military experience proved invaluable when we began planning our response to Razor's expanding territory. He had studied asymmetric warfare and understood how small groups could use superior knowledge and tactics to defeat larger, better, armed forces. The key was to avoid direct confrontation while systematically disrupting their operations and undermining their control. Our first intelligence gathering mission revealed the scope of Razor's organization. They had grown to over 25 people, including several women who were being used for domestic labor and other purposes that I will not describe in detail. They had established 3 separate bases in different parts of the tunnel system, connected by regular patrols that maintained communication and transported supplies between locations. More concerning was their recruitment strategy. They were specifically seeking out people with technical skills, medical training, or knowledge of the city infrastructure. Anyone who refused to join was either driven away from their territory or simply disappeared. I realized that our group, with its combination of medical, military, construction, and tunnel navigation expertise, would be exactly the kind of asset that Razor would want to acquire by any means necessary. The integration of the Henderson family into our group created new dynamics and capabilities that changed our entire approach to survival. Emma and Jake Henderson proved to be natural scouts, small enough to navigate ventilation shafts and maintenance crawlways that adults could not access. Their childlike curiosity led them to discover several previously unknown passages that connected different sections of the cave system, expanding our understanding of the underground geography. Linda Henderson's scientific background became crucial when she began analyzing the air quality in different parts of the tunnel system. She discovered that certain areas had dangerous concentrations of carbon monoxide from malfunctioning heating systems, while others had pockets of methane gas that could create explosion hazards. Her knowledge prevented several potentially fatal accidents and helped us identify the safest locations for permanent settlement. Tom Henderson brought military discipline and tactical thinking that elevated our group from desperate survivors to an organized resistance cell. He established guard schedules, communication protocols, and emergency procedures that would allow us to respond effectively to various threat scenarios. Most importantly, he began training the younger members of our group in basic combat skills and survival tactics. The turning point came during our second week of surveillance, when we witnessed Razor's people attack a family that had been sheltering in the utility tunnels near the old downtown library. The family consisted of an elderly man, his adult daughter, and her 2 young children. They had found a warm maintenance room and had been surviving on canned food they had salvaged from an abandoned store. Razor's patrol discovered them during a routine sweep and demanded that they surrender all their supplies and join his organization. When the daughter tried to negotiate, explaining that her father was too sick to travel and her children were too young to contribute labor, Razor himself arrived to handle the situation personally. What happened next demonstrated the level of cruelty that we were dealing with. Razor separated the family members and told the daughter that she could join his group, but her father was too old to be useful, and her children would be a drain on resources. He gave her a choice. She could watch her family die slowly from cold and starvation, or she could help him end their suffering quickly and accept a place in his organization. The daughter refused, and Razor responded by taking the family's supplies and sealing them into their maintenance room, by welding the door shut from the outside. He told his followers that this was an example of what happened to people who were too weak to make hard decisions. The family would serve as a warning to other survivors about the consequences of defying his authority. Tom and I watched this atrocity from a concealed position, and I could see the rage building in his eyes. As a paramedic, he had dedicated his career to saving lives, and witnessing this deliberate murder was almost more than he could bear. But he also understood that attempting a rescue would have resulted in our own capture or death, which would not have helped the trapped family and would have doomed the rest of our group. That night we held an emergency council meeting in the deep caves. Mrs. Chen, Tom, Linda, and I discussed our options, while the younger members of our group tried to sleep. The brutal execution of the library family had made it clear that we could not coexist with Razor's organization. They were not just competing for resources, they were actively eliminating potential survivors who might threaten their dominance. Linda presented a scientific analysis that supported immediate action. She had been monitoring the surface temperature through one of the ventilation shafts, and the readings showed that conditions were continuing to deteriorate. The average temperature was now -25 degrees Fahrenheit, and still dropping. At this rate, anyone without adequate shelter and heating would be dead within days. This created a time pressure that worked in our favor. Razor's group was growing larger, but they were also consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. Their strategy of taking supplies from other survivors would become less effective as the number of potential victims decreased. Eventually, they would be forced to venture to the surface for additional resources, which would expose them to the same environmental threats that were killing other survivors. Mrs. Chen proposed a strategy that combined her military experience with Tom's knowledge of emergency response tactics. Instead of attacking Razor's main bases directly, we would target their patrol routes and supply lines. By making it dangerous for them to move freely through the tunnel system, we could force them to consolidate their forces in defensive positions while limiting their ability to expand their territory. The first phase of our operation involved mapping their patrol schedules and identifying vulnerable points along their routes. I spent 3 days conducting surveillance missions, using my superior knowledge of the tunnel system to track their movements without being detected. What I discovered was that they were following predictable patterns based on the most obvious pathways through the underground infrastructure. This predictability was their weakness. They were thinking like surface criminals, using intimidation and superior numbers to control territory. But underground warfare required different tactics, and their lack of experience in confined spaces made them vulnerable to ambush and misdirection. During my surveillance, I also discovered something that would prove crucial to our long-term survival. In the deepest sections of the old mining tunnels, there were sealed passages that bore government warning labels from the 1950s. These passages had been blocked off during the Cold War era, presumably because they led to classified facilities or contained hazardous materials. The warning labels were faded and partially illegible, but I could make out references to fallout shelters and emergency supplies. If these sealed areas contained Cold War-era survival equipment, they could provide resources that would be invaluable for our underground community. However, accessing them would require careful planning and possibly dangerous excavation work. Our first strike against Razor's organization was carefully planned to send a message without escalating to lethal violence. Tom and Bill worked together to create a series of booby traps along one of Razor's main patrol routes. These were not designed to kill, but to disable and demoralize. Tripwires connected to noisemakers would alert us to their approach while creating confusion and panic among their forces. The traps worked exactly as intended. When Razor's patrol triggered the first noisemaker, they panicked and began firing weapons randomly into the darkness. This accomplished several objectives simultaneously. It wasted their ammunition, revealed their positions to anyone listening, and demonstrated that they were frightened and disorganized when faced with unexpected threats. More importantly, the incident forced Razor to change his patrol patterns, making his movements less predictable and reducing his ability to control territory effectively. His people began moving in larger groups for protection, which meant fewer patrols overall and larger areas of the tunnel system that were left unguarded. Our second operation was more ambitious. Linda had identified a section of tunnel where Razor's group was storing a significant portion of their looted supplies. The storage area was in an abandoned electrical substation that had been converted into a warehouse for food, weapons, and other essential items. It was guarded, but not heavily, because Razor believed that its location was secret. Tom developed a plan that would allow us to liberate some of these supplies without directly confronting the guards. Using my knowledge of the electrical systems, we could create a power failure that would plunge the storage area into complete darkness. During the confusion, a small team could enter through a maintenance access, take what we needed, and escape before the guards could organize a response. The operation required precise timing and coordination between multiple team members. Bill would create the electrical failure using techniques he had learned as a construction worker. Tom and Marcus would handle the actual infiltration and supply retrieval. Mrs. Chen and I would provide overwatch and early warning from concealed positions. Linda would remain in the caves with the children and coordinate communications using handheld radios that Marcus had salvaged and repaired. Everything went according to plan until we discovered that we were not the only group planning to raid Razor's supply cache. As Tom and Marcus were preparing to enter the storage area through a maintenance tunnel I had identified, we detected movement from another direction. A second team of survivors was approaching the same target, and they were armed and organized enough to pose a serious threat to our operation. The discovery that other survivors were actively opposing Razor's group was encouraging, but it also created a tactical problem. We did not know who these people were, what their intentions were, or whether they would treat us as allies or competitors. In the darkness and confusion of the underground environment, friendly fire incidents were a constant danger. Tom made the decision to abort our planned raid and instead observe this unknown group, to assess their capabilities and intentions. What we saw changed our understanding of the entire situation. This was not another small family group or collection of refugees. This was a well-organized team of at least 8 people with military-style equipment and tactics. Their leader was a woman who moved with the confidence and precision of someone with extensive combat training. Her team used hand signals and coordinated movements that indicated professional military or law enforcement backgrounds. They were not desperate survivors, struggling to stay alive. They were operators conducting a planned mission with specific objectives. The unknown team successfully completed their raid, taking a substantial amount of supplies while leaving behind several improvised explosive devices that would make the storage area unusable for future operations. They moved through the tunnel system with a level of skill that rivaled my own knowledge of the underground infrastructure, suggesting that they had been conducting reconnaissance and planning for an extended period. After they disappeared into the deeper tunnels, Tom and I conducted a careful examination of the raided storage area. The explosive devices they had left behind were sophisticated enough to indicate access to military-grade materials and technical expertise. The supplies they had chosen to take were selected strategically, focusing on medical equipment, communications gear, and high-energy food, rather than the obvious items that desperate survivors would prioritize. This suggested that we were dealing with a group that had a larger strategic plan beyond simple survival. They were preparing for extended operations against Razor's organization, and they had the training and equipment necessary to conduct a sustained campaign. The question was whether they would view our smaller group as potential allies or as obstacles to their objectives. The answer came 2 days later, when Linda detected radio transmissions on a frequency that Marcus had been monitoring. The signals were encrypted, but the transmission schedule and duration suggested tactical communications between multiple teams. Someone was coordinating a complex operation involving several groups of survivors, and Razor's organization was clearly the primary target. Mrs. Chen recognized the communication patterns from her military experience. This was not amateur radio chatter between desperate survivors. This was professional military coordination, using protocols that indicated special operations training. She believed that we were witnessing the beginning of an organized resistance movement that was being led by people with the skills and resources necessary to challenge Razor's growing power effectively. The implications were enormous. If there was indeed an organized resistance movement operating in the Denver tunnel system, our small group would need to decide whether to attempt contact, continue operating independently, or relocate to avoid being caught between opposing forces. Each option carried significant risks, but remaining passive was no longer viable. The decision was made for us when Marcus detected movement in the tunnels near our cave refuge. Someone was conducting surveillance of our position, and they were skilled enough to avoid the early warning systems that Tom had established around our base. We were being watched by professionals who could choose to contact us, attack us, or simply monitor our activities for purposes unknown. During this period of uncertainty, I made the decision to investigate the sealed Cold War-era passages that I had discovered during my surveillance missions. If we were going to be forced into a larger conflict, we would need every advantage we could find. The sealed passages might contain supplies, weapons, or equipment that could tip the balance in our favor. Breaking through the government seals required careful work to avoid triggering any booby traps or releasing hazardous materials. Bill's construction experience proved invaluable as we slowly and methodically removed the concrete barriers that had sealed the passages for over 70 years. What we found exceeded our wildest expectations. Behind the seals was a fully equipped fallout shelter that had been constructed during the height of the Cold War. The facility contained enough food, water, and medical supplies to support 50 people for 6 months. More importantly, it contained communications equipment, weapons, and technical manuals that would be invaluable for our resistance operations. The discovery of the fallout shelter changed our strategic position completely. We now had a secure base that was unknown to both Razor's organization and the mysterious military group that was operating in the tunnels. We had supplies that would allow us to support a larger community of survivors, and we had equipment that would allow us to coordinate with other resistance cells if they existed. But as we began moving our essential supplies into the fallout shelter, we discovered that we were not the first people to find this hidden facility. There were recent signs of occupation, including fresh food containers and equipment that had been moved from its original positions. Someone else knew about the shelter, and they had been using it as a base of operations. The realization that our secret refuge was already known to unknown parties forced us to accelerate our timeline once again. We were no longer just hiding from Razor's patrols or wondering about the identity of the professional military team. We were now potentially trespassing in someone else's operational base, and that someone had remained hidden despite our careful surveillance of the area. As I prepared to conduct a counter-surveillance mission to identify whoever was watching us and using our shelter, I realized that our underground war was about to become much more complicated than any of us had anticipated. The next phase of our survival would depend not just on avoiding Razor's violence or the environmental threats of the volcanic winter, but on navigating the complex politics of multiple survivor groups with competing interests and unknown agendas. The counter-surveillance mission revealed something that fundamentally changed our understanding of who we were dealing with in the underground tunnels. The people watching us were not another group of desperate survivors, or even Razor's expanded organization. They were members of a government continuity operation that had been activated when Yellowstone erupted, and they had been using the Cold War fallout shelter as a forward operating base for weeks before we discovered it. The team leader introduced herself as Captain Sarah Martinez, formerly of the Colorado National Guard, now operating under emergency protocols established for catastrophic events that threatened the continuity of government. Her team consisted of 7 other military personnel who had been tasked with establishing secure communications with other government facilities and assessing the viability of underground infrastructure for long-term population survival. Captain Martinez explained that our discovery of the fallout shelter had been anticipated. The facility had been designed with multiple access points, and anyone with sufficient knowledge of Denver's underground infrastructure would eventually find their way to the sealed passages. What had impressed her team was not that we had found the shelter, but how we had organized ourselves as a functional survival community while actively resisting the criminal elements that were threatening other survivors. The government continuity operation was much larger than we had realized. Teams like Captain Martinez's were operating in underground facilities across the Denver metropolitan area, coordinating with similar operations in other major cities throughout the region affected by the Yellowstone eruption. Their mission was to preserve essential government functions and maintain law and order during the extended crisis period that was expected to last several years. However, the government teams were facing the same resource constraints and environmental threats that were affecting civilian survivors. They had emergency supplies and communication equipment, but they were cut off from higher command structures and operating with limited personnel. Most importantly, they lacked the detailed knowledge of local underground infrastructure that was essential for long-term survival in the tunnel systems. Captain Martinez proposed a cooperation agreement that would benefit both our groups. Her team would provide military-grade equipment, weapons, and communication capabilities that would significantly enhance our security and operational effectiveness. In exchange, our group would share our knowledge of the tunnel systems and assist with the mission to establish a stable survivor community that could serve as a foundation for eventual reconstruction efforts. The proposal created intense debate within our group. Tom Henderson was immediately supportive, recognizing the advantages of cooperation with trained military personnel who shared our objectives of protecting innocent survivors and eliminating criminal threats. Mrs. Chen was more cautious, pointing out that government authority had collapsed when the crisis began, and that military units were now essentially operating as independent armed groups with their own agendas. Linda Henderson raised scientific concerns about the government team's long-term planning. According to her analysis of atmospheric conditions and volcanic activity, the surface environment would remain hostile for at least 2 years, possibly much longer. Any plans that assumed normal government operations would resume within months were unrealistic and potentially dangerous for the survivors who depended on those plans. I was personally conflicted about the cooperation proposal. My years of studying historical disasters had taught me that government responses to catastrophic events were often ineffective and sometimes counterproductive. However, Captain Martinez's team had resources and capabilities that our small group desperately needed, particularly as Razor's organization continued to grow and become more dangerous. The decision was made for us when Marcus detected radio communications indicating that Razor had learned about the government team's presence in the tunnel system. His organization was planning a coordinated attack on what they believed was a small military unit with valuable weapons and equipment. They had no idea that the government team was connected to a larger network of similar units, and they were underestimating the level of training and preparation that professional soldiers would bring to underground combat. Captain Martinez confirmed that her team had been tracking Razor's communications and movements for over a week. They had identified his main bases, mapped his patrol routes, and developed detailed intelligence about his organizational structure and capabilities. The attack that Razor was planning would actually serve the government team's objectives by drawing his forces into a confrontation where superior training and equipment would provide decisive advantages. However, the government team's mission parameters required them to prioritize the protection of civilian survivors, which meant that our group and other innocent people in the tunnel system could become casualties if we were caught in the crossfire between Razor's forces and the military response. The safest option would be to evacuate all civilian survivors to secure locations before the confrontation began. This created a logistical challenge that required our cooperation regardless of our concerns about working with the government team. There were at least 15 other survivor groups scattered throughout the tunnel system, including families with young children and elderly people who would need assistance to reach safety. The evacuation would have to be conducted quickly and quietly to avoid alerting Razor's patrols to the impending military operation. Tom Henderson volunteered to coordinate the civilian evacuation using his paramedic experience and knowledge of emergency response procedures. Mrs. Chen would provide medical support for survivors who were injured or sick. Bill would handle the technical aspects of moving groups through difficult tunnel sections. Marcus would maintain communications between the various teams using the radio equipment that Captain Martinez had provided. My role was to serve as the primary guide for the evacuation routes, using my detailed knowledge of the tunnel system to identify the safest and most efficient pathways between survivor locations and the secure areas that the government team had established. This was perhaps the most important responsibility I had ever accepted, because mistakes in navigation could result in evacuation groups encountering Razor's patrols or becoming lost in sections of the tunnel system where rescue would be impossible. The evacuation began before dawn on what would become the most dangerous day of our underground survival. Our first target was a group of 6 survivors who had been hiding in a maintenance room beneath the old Daniels and Fisher Tower. The group included an elderly couple, 2 middle-aged women who were sisters, and 2 teenage boys who had been separated from their families during the initial chaos after the eruption. Reaching their location required navigating through 3 different tunnel systems while avoiding 2 of Razor's regular patrol routes. The elderly couple was barely mobile due to malnutrition and exposure, requiring us to carry them through several sections where the tunnels were too narrow for normal passage. The teenage boys were strong enough to help with the evacuation, but traumatized enough to require constant reassurance that we were leading them to safety, rather than into another dangerous situation. The second evacuation group was located in the old subway tunnels near Union Station, dangerously close to one of Razor's main bases. This group consisted of a single mother with 3 young children who had been surviving by scavenging in areas that Razor's people had already searched and abandoned. The children were malnourished and suffering from respiratory problems caused by poor air quality in their hiding place. Extracting this family required the most complex route of the entire evacuation operation. We had to use maintenance crawlways that were barely large enough for adults, utility shafts that required climbing equipment, and abandoned mining tunnels that had not been used for over a century. The youngest child was only 4 years old and had to be carried through most of the journey, while the older children struggled to keep up with the pace required to avoid Razor's patrols. The third evacuation presented a moral dilemma that tested our commitment to saving every possible survivor. The group consisted of 4 people who had been hiding in a storage area that was directly adjacent to one of Razor's secondary bases. They included a man who had been beaten by Razor's people when he tried to protect his supplies, a woman who was suffering from untreated injuries sustained during the initial panic after the eruption, and 2 teenagers who were siblings but had been separated from their parents. Attempting to extract this group would require penetrating the perimeter of Razor's base and conducting the evacuation under the direct observation of hostile forces. The risk of detection was extremely high, and failure would not only doom the people we were trying to save, but would also compromise the entire military operation by alerting Razor to the government team's presence. Captain Martinez initially recommended abandoning this group to preserve the security of the larger operation, but Tom Henderson refused to accept leaving civilians to die when we had the capability to save them. He proposed a diversionary tactic that would draw Razor's guards away from the storage area long enough for us to complete the extraction. The diversion involved creating a false emergency in a different part of Razor's territory that would require immediate response from his security teams. Marcus would use his electronic skills to trigger fire alarms in an abandoned office building that was connected to the tunnel system through utility passages. The noise and apparent threat would force Razor's people to investigate, creating a window of opportunity for the evacuation team to reach the trapped survivors. The plan worked perfectly until we discovered that the group we were trying to save, included someone who was too injured to be moved safely. The woman with untreated injuries had developed a severe infection that required immediate medical attention, and attempting to transport her through the tunnel system would likely result in her death. Mrs. Chen assessed her condition and determined that she needed surgery and antibiotics that were not available in our underground medical facilities. This created an impossible choice between abandoning a dying woman or risking the entire evacuation operation by attempting to transport someone who could not survive the journey. The decision was complicated by the fact that the woman was conscious and aware of her situation, and she was begging us not to leave her behind to face whatever Razor's people would do when they discovered our rescue attempt. Tom Henderson made the decision that none of the rest of us could make. He administered pain medication to make the woman as comfortable as possible, then carried her anyway despite Mrs. Chen's medical assessment that the journey would kill her. He said that if she was going to die, she would die among people who cared about her rather than at the hands of criminals who saw her as nothing more than a burden. The woman died in Tom's arms halfway through the evacuation route, but her death served a purpose that honored her final request to help save the other members of her group. Her siblings and the injured man reached safety because Tom refused to abandon her, and her sacrifice became a rallying point for our determination to save every survivor we could find. The final evacuation group was the largest and most complex. 12 people had been hiding in a network of connected maintenance rooms beneath the old May Company building, including 3 families with young children and 2 elderly men who had been pooling their resources to survive together. This group had been relatively successful at avoiding Razor's attention, but they were slowly starving because they lacked the knowledge and equipment necessary to find food in the underground environment. Moving 12 people through the tunnel system without detection required dividing them into smaller groups and using multiple evacuation routes simultaneously. Each group would need guides who were familiar with different sections of the underground infrastructure, and the timing would have to be coordinated precisely to ensure that all groups reached safety before Razor's forces realized that a large-scale evacuation was underway. Captain Martinez provided additional military personnel to serve as guides and security for the evacuation groups, but the success of the operation still depended primarily on civilian knowledge of the tunnel system. I found myself responsible for coordinating the movements of over 30 people through an underground maze while hostile forces were actively patrolling the same area. The evacuation was completed successfully, but just barely. The last group reached safety only minutes before Razor's forces returned from investigating the diversionary fire alarm and discovered that their prisoners were missing. The discovery that organized resistance was operating in their territory prompted Razor to accelerate his plans for expanding control over the entire tunnel system. Captain Martinez confirmed through intercepted communications that Razor was planning a major offensive operation that would sweep through every section of the underground infrastructure to eliminate any organized opposition to his authority. He had recruited additional followers by promising them shares of the weapons and equipment that he expected to capture from the government team, and he was preparing for what he believed would be a decisive battle that would establish his permanent dominance over the survivor community. The government team's response was to implement their own version of a decisive battle, but with very different objectives than Razor anticipated. Instead of defending fixed positions and waiting for attack, they would conduct a preemptive strike that would eliminate Razor's leadership and scatter his followers before they could organize their offensive operation. The military operation would begin within hours, and our role as civilian guides and intelligence sources was complete. Captain Martinez ordered our group to remain in the secure areas with the other evacuated survivors, while her team conducted combat operations against Razor's forces. She explained that civilian involvement in the fighting would create unnecessary risks and complications that could compromise the mission effectiveness. However, the plan to keep civilians out of the fighting was disrupted when we discovered that Razor had taken hostages from survivor groups that we had not been able to locate during the evacuation. These hostages included children and elderly people who would be used as human shields during the confrontation with the government forces. Razor was prepared to execute innocent people rather than surrender his control over the tunnel system. This discovery changed the parameters of the military operation and forced Captain Martinez to accept civilian involvement in the rescue mission. Our knowledge of the tunnel system and our established relationships with the survivor community would be essential for locating and extracting the hostages before the main assault began. As we prepared for what would become the final confrontation with Razor's organization, I realized that our underground war was about to reach its climax in a battle that would determine not just who controlled the tunnel system, but what kind of society would emerge from the ashes of the old world. The final confrontation with Razor's organization began not with the military assault we had planned, but with an environmental disaster that changed everything. While Captain Martinez's team was preparing their coordinated strike and we were gathering intelligence on the hostage locations, a section of the old mining tunnels collapsed due to water damage from frozen and burst pipes above ground. The collapse trapped 3 of Razor's people in tunnels that were rapidly flooding with contaminated water from the surface. What happened next revealed something about human nature that I had not expected to witness in our underground war. When Razor's lieutenant came to Captain Martinez under a temporary truce flag to request assistance with the rescue operation, she did not hesitate to provide help. Tom Henderson and I joined the rescue team because we had the most detailed knowledge of the tunnel system's water flow patterns and emergency access routes. The rescue operation required us to work directly alongside people we had been fighting against for weeks. Razor himself participated in the effort to save his trapped followers, and I observed him displaying genuine concern for their welfare that contradicted the image of pure ruthlessness that his actions had created. When one of the trapped men was pulled from the flooded tunnel barely conscious, Razor personally administered first aid while tears ran down his face. This moment of shared humanity in the face of mortal danger created an opportunity for dialogue that Captain Martinez was experienced enough to recognize and exploit. She proposed extending the temporary truce to allow negotiations about the future governance of the underground survivor community. The alternative was a battle that would result in casualties on all sides while the environmental threats continued to worsen around us. The negotiations took place in the old fallout shelter that had become our temporary command center. Razor arrived with 2 of his most trusted lieutenants, while our side was represented by Captain Martinez, Tom Henderson, Mrs. Chen, and myself. The discussion began with each side presenting their vision for how the survivor community should be organized and governed during the extended crisis period. Razor's position was based on his belief that traditional democratic and legal structures had collapsed along with the surface world, and that survival required strong leadership, willing to make hard decisions without the constraints of moral considerations that belonged to the old world. He argued that his organization had been successful because they understood that resources were limited and that competition between survivor groups would inevitably result in the strong taking what they needed from the weak. He explained his background in detail for the first time during these negotiations. He had grown up in poverty in East Denver, been involved in gang activity as a teenager, and served 8 years in state prison for armed robbery. Prison had taught him that human society was fundamentally based on power relationships, and that people who were unwilling to use violence to protect their interests would inevitably become victims of those who were more ruthless. The eruption had confirmed his worldview by demonstrating how quickly civilized behavior disappeared when survival was at stake. He had witnessed supposedly decent people abandon their neighbors, steal from children, and commit acts of cruelty that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. His organization's harsh methods were simply an honest acknowledgement of human nature when the veneer of civilization was stripped away. Captain Martinez presented the government continuity position, which was that constitutional authority and rule of law remained valid even during catastrophic events, and that military and civilian authorities had both the legal mandate and practical capability to maintain order and protect civilian populations. She emphasized that cooperation between organized groups would be more effective than competition for achieving long-term survival and eventual recovery. Her perspective was shaped by 20 years of military service that had included deployments to disaster zones and conflict areas throughout the world. She had observed that communities which maintained some form of democratic governance and respect for individual rights were more resilient and adaptable than those that relied purely on authoritarian control. Military discipline was essential for emergency response, but it had to be balanced with civilian leadership for long-term success. The government continuity operation she represented was based on constitutional provisions that allowed for the suspension of normal governmental functions during national emergencies while preserving essential democratic institutions. The goal was not to establish permanent military rule, but to maintain the basic framework of American democracy until normal civilian government could be restored. Mrs. Chen offered a perspective that surprised everyone in the room. She proposed that both the criminal gang model and the military authority model were based on assumptions about human nature and social organization that might not be applicable to our unprecedented situation. She suggested that we were not just trying to survive a temporary disaster, but were actually pioneering a new form of human society that would need to function effectively in conditions that had never existed before in recorded history. Her analysis was based on her experiences as a refugee who had fled war-torn Vietnam and rebuilt her life in America, her decades as a military nurse treating casualties from various conflicts, and her observations of how different cultural groups had adapted to extreme circumstances throughout history. She believed that successful societies were those that could balance individual initiative with collective cooperation in ways that maximized both personal freedom and community survival. The environmental conditions we were facing would persist for years, possibly decades. The surface world that had supported previous forms of human civilization was gone, and it would not return in any recognizable form within our lifetimes. This meant that the social structures we created in the underground community would become the foundation for whatever form of human society emerged from the volcanic winter. Linda Henderson contributed scientific analysis that supported Mrs. Chen's perspective. Her monitoring of surface conditions indicated that the ash cloud was not dissipating as quickly as the most optimistic projections had suggested. Global average temperatures had dropped by more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit and were still falling. Agricultural production had ceased throughout most of North America, and there were reports of similar conditions throughout the Northern Hemisphere. The atmospheric modeling that Linda had constructed using data from historical volcanic events suggested that the climate disruption would persist for at least 3 to 5 years, with some effects lasting decades. The Yellowstone eruption had injected unprecedented amounts of ash and sulfur compounds into the upper atmosphere, creating a global cooling effect that would prevent normal weather patterns from returning for the foreseeable future. The implications were staggering. We were not dealing with a regional disaster that would be resolved through outside assistance. We were dealing with a global catastrophe that had fundamentally altered the conditions that made modern civilization possible. The underground communities that were forming in cities throughout the affected region might be among the few human settlements that would survive the coming years of climate chaos and social collapse. This realization changed the nature of our negotiations. We were not just discussing how to share resources and territory during a temporary emergency. We were essentially writing the Constitution for a new form of human society that would need to function in conditions that required cooperation, innovation, and long-term planning on a scale that previous civilizations had never achieved. Razor proved to be surprisingly thoughtful when the discussion shifted from immediate survival tactics to long-term social planning. His experience with prison hierarchies had taught him about the importance of clear rules, consistent enforcement, and the need to balance individual rights with collective security. He was willing to consider modifications to his authoritarian approach if they could be shown to improve the overall effectiveness of the community's survival strategy. He acknowledged that his methods had been shaped by the desperate circumstances of the first few weeks after the eruption, when quick decisions and harsh discipline had been necessary to prevent his group from disintegrating into chaos. However, he recognized that long-term community building would require different approaches that could maintain morale and motivation over extended periods without relying solely on fear and intimidation. The breakthrough came when Tom Henderson proposed a hybrid governance structure that would combine military efficiency for emergency situations with democratic decision-making for long-term planning and resource allocation. The community would be organized into specialized work groups responsible for different aspects of survival, such as food production, medical care, infrastructure maintenance, and external security. Each work group would have significant autonomy within their area of expertise, but major decisions affecting the entire community would require consensus among group leaders. Captain Martinez accepted this proposal because it preserved the chain of command structure necessary for coordinating defensive operations while allowing civilian expertise to guide decisions about technical and social issues that were outside military competence. The government continuity mission required maintaining some form of democratic accountability, and the work group structure provided a way to achieve this without compromising operational effectiveness. Razor accepted the proposal because it provided clear leadership roles and responsibilities, while preventing any single individual or group from accumulating unchecked power over the entire community. His experience with gang hierarchies had shown him the dangers of concentrated authority, and he was willing to share power if it meant creating a more stable and sustainable organization. The hostage situation was resolved as part of the broader agreement. Razor acknowledged that holding innocent people as human shields was counterproductive to the community-building effort and released all captives to participate freely in the new governance structure. Several of his former hostages chose to remain affiliated with his work group because they had developed respect for his leadership abilities despite disagreeing with his previous methods. The integration of the various survivor groups into a unified community was a complex process that required weeks of careful negotiation and adjustment. We had to develop systems for fair distribution of resources, assignment of living spaces, resolution of interpersonal conflicts, and coordination of work assignments. Most challenging was the need to blend people from very different backgrounds and value systems into a cohesive group that could function effectively under extreme stress. The work group system evolved organically as people gravitated toward roles that matched their skills and interests. The medical group was led by Mrs. Chen and included Tom Henderson, whose paramedic training complemented her nursing background. The infrastructure group was managed by Bill, the construction worker, with assistance from Marcus, whose electronic skills proved essential for maintaining communications and power systems. The security group was jointly led by Captain Martinez and Razor, combining military training with street-level survival skills. This partnership was initially tense, but both leaders recognized that their different approaches were complementary rather than contradictory. Military discipline provided structure and coordination, while Razor's understanding of criminal behavior helped identify and counter threats from hostile survivor groups. Mrs. Chen emerged as one of the most influential leaders in the new community structure. Her medical background made her essential for maintaining the health and welfare of over 40 people living in confined underground spaces. Her military experience provided credibility with both the government team and Razor's former followers. Most importantly, her age and wisdom made her a natural mediator when conflicts arose between different factions within the community. Tom Henderson became the de facto leader of the infrastructure maintenance work group, combining his paramedic training with his practical experience in emergency response situations. He was responsible for ensuring that our underground living spaces remained safe and habitable as the surface conditions continued to deteriorate. This included maintaining air circulation systems, managing waste disposal, and monitoring structural integrity of the various tunnel sections we occupied. Linda Henderson established what amounted to the community's research and development department. She continued monitoring surface conditions and analyzing long-term environmental trends, but she also began investigating ways to expand our underground agricultural capability and improve our resource recycling systems. Her scientific approach to problem-solving became essential for developing innovative solutions to challenges that had no historical precedents. The agricultural experiments that Linda initiated were crucial for long-term sustainability. She had identified sections of the tunnel system where geothermal activity created warm, humid conditions suitable for growing food crops. Using seeds and equipment salvaged from the surface, she began developing hydroponic systems that could produce vegetables and grains in the underground environment. Marcus proved to be invaluable for maintaining communications with other survivor communities that were forming in underground locations throughout the Denver metropolitan area. His electronic skills allowed him to establish radio networks that connected us with similar groups in Boulder, Colorado Springs, and Fort Collins. These communications revealed that our community was part of a larger network of underground settlements that were developing throughout the region. My role in the new community structure was as the chief navigator and external reconnaissance coordinator. I was responsible for maintaining detailed maps of the entire underground infrastructure, identifying new areas suitable for expansion, and conducting scouting missions to locate additional resources and survivor groups. This work took me throughout the tunnel system on a regular basis, giving me a comprehensive view of how our underground civilization was developing. The mapping project had expanded far beyond my original documentation of Denver's underground infrastructure. We were now creating detailed charts of natural cave systems, abandoned mining networks, and utility tunnels that extended throughout the Front Range region. These maps would become essential reference materials for the expanding network of underground communities that were being established across Colorado. The most significant discovery during this period was that our community was not unique. The radio communications that Marcus had established revealed that similar underground communities were forming in major cities throughout the western United States. Some were organized around military continuity operations like Captain Martinez's team, others around civilian leadership like our hybrid model, and still others around various forms of authoritarian control similar to Razor's original approach. More importantly, these communities were beginning to establish trade relationships and mutual assistance agreements that created a broader economic and social network spanning multiple states. We were not just surviving as an isolated group. We were becoming part of a new form of human civilization that was adapted to the post-eruption environmental conditions. The trade relationships were essential for long-term survival because no single underground community had access to all the resources and expertise necessary for complete self-sufficiency. Our community had excellent knowledge of underground infrastructure and water systems, but we lacked agricultural capability and manufacturing resources. Communities in other cities had different strengths and weaknesses, creating opportunities for mutually beneficial exchange. Captain Martinez coordinated with other government continuity teams to establish secure communication networks and transportation routes between underground communities. This required developing new protocols for underground travel that could be used safely, despite the hostile surface conditions. The routes connected communities through natural cave systems, abandoned mining networks, and utility tunnels that spanned distances of over 100 miles. The establishment of inter-community trade and communication marked the beginning of what historians who study our records will probably identify as the foundation period of post-eruption civilization. We were no longer just survivors hiding from a temporary disaster. We were pioneers creating new forms of human society that would persist long after the surface world recovered from the volcanic winter. 6 weeks after the Yellowstone eruption, our underground community had grown to 58 people living in a network of connected facilities that included the original fallout shelter, portions of the old mining tunnel system, and several renovated utility installations. We had established sustainable systems for food production, water purification, waste management, and power generation using geothermal and mechanical sources. Most importantly, we had developed a social structure that balanced individual freedom with collective security and long-term planning. The workgroup system had evolved into specialized departments that functioned like the organs of a larger organism, each contributing essential capabilities while depending on the others for resources and support that no single group could provide independently. The children in our community had adapted to underground life with remarkable resilience. Emma and Jake Henderson had become expert navigators who could move through tunnel systems that challenged many adults. Amy and Derek, the teenagers who had lost their parents, had developed technical skills that made them valuable contributors to the infrastructure maintenance and communications departments. The psychological adaptation was as important as the practical achievements. People who had initially viewed underground living as a temporary emergency measure had begun to think of the tunnel community as their permanent home. They were making long-term plans, forming new relationships, and developing cultural practices that were adapted to the unique conditions of underground civilization. Linda Henderson's scientific monitoring indicated that surface conditions were beginning to stabilize, but at temperature levels that would remain hostile to normal human habitation for several more years. The volcanic ash was gradually settling out of the atmosphere, but the global climate disruption would persist long enough to prevent the revival of surface agriculture and industrial activity. This meant that our underground communities would need to continue developing and expanding their capabilities for the foreseeable future. We were not just waiting for rescue or recovery. We were building the foundation for a new phase of human civilization that would eventually emerge from the underground to reclaim and rebuild the surface world. The radio communications with other communities brought news that confirmed the global scope of the disaster. Similar underground settlements were being established throughout North America, Europe, and Asia, wherever volcanic ash had created uninhabitable surface conditions. Some communities were thriving, others were struggling, and many had failed completely due to resource shortages, internal conflicts, or environmental hazards. Our community's success was due to a combination of factors that included detailed, pre-disaster preparation, effective leadership during the crisis period, and the willingness to adapt traditional social structures to unprecedented environmental conditions. Most importantly, we had learned to balance competition and cooperation in ways that maximized both individual survival and collective capability. The lessons we learned during those first 6 weeks became the foundation for a comprehensive survival manual that we shared with other underground communities throughout the regional network. The manual covered everything from tunnel navigation and resource management to conflict resolution and community governance. It became one of the most widely distributed documents in the post-eruption world. As I record this final segment of our survival story, I am sitting in the expanded command center of what has become known throughout the regional underground network as the Denver Central Community. We have established permanent trade relationships with over 20 other underground settlements. We have sent exploration teams to identify suitable locations for new communities, and we have begun planning for the eventual transition back to surface living when environmental conditions permit. The experience of surviving the first 6 weeks after the Yellowstone eruption taught us that human beings are capable of adapting to conditions that would have seemed impossible before the crisis began. We learned that cooperation is more effective than competition for achieving long-term survival, that leadership must be based on expertise and consent rather than just authority or force, and that new forms of social organization can emerge quickly when they are necessary for survival. If you are watching this recording, it means that our underground civilization has persisted long enough for someone to find and share our story. It means that the knowledge we gained during those first desperate weeks has been preserved and can help other survivors who face similar challenges. Most importantly, it means that human civilization survived the Yellowstone eruption and found ways to adapt to a world that was fundamentally different from anything in our previous experience. The underground communities that emerge from the volcanic winter will eventually return to the surface and rebuild human civilization using the lessons we learned during the dark years beneath the earth. We have proven that human beings can survive and thrive under conditions that seemed impossible, and we have created new forms of social cooperation that may be more effective than the systems that existed before the eruption. Our story is not just about survival. It is about adaptation, innovation, and the fundamental resilience of human nature when faced with challenges that require us to transcend our individual limitations and work together toward common goals that benefit everyone in the community.